Most people believe strength means staying open, answering every message, showing up for everyone, explaining yourself again and again. But there's a moment in every powerful life when that belief quietly dies, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small realization. And once you see it, you can never unsee it, because the truth is uncomfortable. Not everyone who reaches you deserves access to you. And the strange part, most people only discover this after it has already cost them something: time, energy, trust. Sometimes something even deeper. There's a quiet kind of exhaustion that comes from being available to the world, especially when people assume that because you're capable, you're also unlimited. But you're not. No one is. And if you've ever been the person who carries more than others realize, the one who solves problems while everyone else sleeps, the one who listens more than they speak, then you already know how dangerous unlimited access can become. Because people rarely knock politely on an open door. They walk in, they stay longer than they should, and sometimes they rearrange the entire room. There's a story people like to imagine about powerful individuals, that they were always confident, always distant, always guarded. But that's rarely how it begins. In the early days, openness feels like strength. You take every call. You explain your ideas to anyone curious enough to ask. You give people chances, many chances. Sometimes too many. And for a while, that openness feels like progress, until the first moment something cracks. It was late one evening. The kind of quiet hour when the world slows down but the mind doesn't. A desk light glowed over scattered notes and unfinished thoughts. Outside the window, the city moved like distant machinery, headlights sliding across wet pavement after a brief rain. Inside the room, the air felt still, except for the sound of a phone vibrating. Once, then again. And again. Not urgent messages, just people wanting something: advice, access, attention. At first it seemed harmless. After all, being reachable is a kind of courtesy in modern life. People respect it, they admire it. But something about that moment felt different, not overwhelming, just revealing. Because every message carried the same quiet assumption: you're available. And that assumption started to feel heavier than it should have. Not anger, not frustration, just a small question forming in the back of the mind: why do so many people feel entitled to my time? It's a question many people avoid asking, especially people who are naturally capable. Capable people attract needs. Requests. Expectations. The more you accomplish, the more doors people expect you to leave open. And at first, you do, because it feels generous. But generosity without boundaries slowly turns into something else: obligation. And obligation has a strange way of draining even the strongest personalities. That night, the phone vibrated again, a message from someone who had once seemed important, someone who had praised the vision, admired the ambition, talked enthusiastically about shared goals. But now the tone was different. Short. Transactional. A request disguised as familiarity. Nothing aggressive, nothing obviously wrong, but something in the energy had changed. And sometimes it only takes a small shift in tone to reveal a deeper truth. The message stayed on the screen for a long time before being answered, not because the answer was difficult, but because a realization was forming. One that most people resist for years, sometimes their entire lives. Access is power. And power given to freely eventually attracts the wrong people. Not always intentionally. Sometimes people don't even realize they're doing it. They just slowly adjust to the idea that you will always be there. Always available. Always responsive. Always explaining. And once that expectation settles in, it becomes invisible. Until one day you notice something unsettling: you're spending more energy managing people than building the things that actually matter. That realization can feel almost disloyal, because part of you still wants to believe in openness. In collaboration, in giving people chances. But there's another part, quieter, more honest, that sees something else. Some people are inspired by your openness, others simply consume it, and the difference isn't always obvious at first. That's the dangerous part. Because the people who take the most access rarely announce themselves. They blend in, they sound supportive, they ask thoughtful questions, they position themselves close to the center of your attention. Until suddenly you realize something uncomfortable. They're not really interested in your vision, they're interested in your proximity. And proximity can be intoxicating. It makes people feel important, connected, relevant. But proximity without purpose slowly erodes clarity. That night, staring at the quiet glow of the phone screen, another realization surfaced. A difficult one. Sometimes the people who ask for the most access respect you the least. Not openly, not intentionally, but in the way they treat your time, your attention, your mental space. Because respect has a strange signal. It shows up in restraint. People who truly respect you don't demand constant access. They understand something others don't. Single quotes. Your focus is limited. Your energy is finite. And if you've ever been the person responsible for building something bigger than yourself, you know how fragile that focus can be. One distraction here. Another small conversation there. A dozen tiny requests scattered across the day. Individually harmless. Collectively exhausting. This is the part of the story most people never see. The hidden cost of openness, the quiet erosion of attention, the slow leaking of creative energy into places it was never meant to go, and the hardest part, realizing you allowed it, not because you were weak, but because you believed something generous about people, that if you stayed open, they would treat that openness with care. Sometimes they do, but not always, and once that pattern becomes visible, something shifts. You start noticing who respects silence, who respects distance, who only appears when there's something to gain. The signals were always there, just hidden under the noise of constant availability. And the moment you see it clearly, a new question begins to form, a dangerous question, not who deserves your help, but something much harder. Who actually deserves access to you? Some of you already know that moment, that quiet shift when generosity begins to collide with reality. When you realize that protecting your attention isn't selfish. It's necessary. But recognizing that truth is only the beginning, because the real challenge comes next. Once you understand that not everyone deserves access, how do you decide who does? And more importantly, what happens when the people you must limit access to are the ones who expect it the most? The moment you start limiting access, something strange happens. People notice, not immediately. At first, it's subtle, almost invisible. A message that used to get an instant reply now sits unanswered for a few hours. A call goes to voicemail. A conversation that would have stretched for 30 minutes suddenly ends in 5 small shifts, quiet adjustments. But the world is incredibly sensitive to changes in availability, especially when someone has grown used to your presence. And the moment that presence begins to shrink, reactions begin. Some people respect it. Others become confused, and a few become uncomfortable in ways they don't fully understand, because access creates a psychological illusion. It makes people feel close to you even when they're not, and when that illusion starts to disappear, the response can be unpredictable. The strange thing about boundaries is that they rarely reveal who people are when things are easy. They reveal who people are when something is taken away. There was another moment. Not dramatic, not loud. Just a quiet afternoon, meeting in a glass-walled conference room overlooking a city that never seemed to stop moving. Sunlight bounced off steel buildings. Cars crawled along distant highways like slow mechanical insects inside the room. A handful of people sat around a table scattered with tablets, notebooks, and half-finished cups of coffee. The conversation had started normally. Ideas, timelines, possibilities, but then the energy shifted. One person leaned back in their chair and said something that sounded casual on the surface. "Why didn't you mention this earlier?" The tone wasn't aggressive, but it carried a subtle assumption that they should have known, that they should have been included, that access was expected. And in that moment, a quiet realization passed through the room like an invisible current. Not everyone around that table had earned the same level of insight, but everyone assumed they deserved it. And assumptions can be dangerous, because once people believe they are entitled to something, removing it feels like betrayal, even when it never belonged to them in the first place. The room grew slightly quieter after that comment. Not awkward. Just aware. And it revealed something deeper about human nature. People don't always want access because they care about the work. Sometimes they want access because access feels like power. Like influence, like proximity to something important. It's a strange psychological gravity. The closer people feel to momentum, the more they want to attach themselves to it, even if they're not contributing to its direction. And if you've ever been the person responsible for steering something large, you begin to notice the difference between people who help move the mission forward and people who simply orbit it. Orbiting looks supportive from a distance, but up close, it can drain momentum in ways that are hard to explain. More meetings, more explanations, more emotional energy spent maintaining relationships that aren't actually aligned. And at first, you tolerate it because part of you wants to believe collaboration means inclusion. But over time, something becomes painfully clear: not everyone who wants access actually understands the cost of it. Every conversation takes mental bandwidth. Every explanation fractures attention. Every unnecessary discussion slows down the thinking required to build something meaningful. And when your mind is responsible for solving problems most people can't even see yet, distraction becomes a liability. There's a moment many builders experience, a moment when the world begins asking more questions than it answers. More opinions appear, more voices enter the room, and suddenly the clarity that once drove everything forward begins to feel crowded. That's when the real tension begins, because protecting your focus doesn't just change your schedule. It changes your relationships. People who once felt included start feeling distant. Some will ask about it directly. Others won't say anything, but their tone changes. The warmth becomes cooler, the enthusiasm becomes cautious, and a quiet narrative begins forming behind your back. He's harder to reach now, she's changed, they're becoming distant. What most people don't realize is that distance is sometimes the only way to protect vision, but distance has a social cost. People often interpret boundaries as rejection, even when they're simply protection. There was a moment after that meeting ended. The room had emptied, coffee cups abandoned on the table. The sunlight had shifted slightly, casting longer reflections across the glass walls. One person remained behind, a colleague who had been quiet during most of the conversation. They stood near the window, looking down at the city traffic below. And after a long pause, they said something simple: "You're starting to filter people." Not accusatory, just observant. And for a second, the words hung in the air. Filtering people. It sounded colder than it felt, but it wasn't entirely wrong, because filtering isn't about arrogance. It's about clarity, and clarity often arrives after you've made the mistake of giving too much access to the wrong people. The colleague turned away from the window. "You know what's going to happen, right?" Another pause. "They won't like it." That statement carried a quiet truth, because when people lose access, they rarely interpret it as strategy. They interpret it as judgment, and that's where the real psychological conflict begins, not external conflict. Internal. Part of you still wants to be the person who gives everyone a chance, who answers every message, who listens to every perspective. But another part, the part that has felt the slow drain of scattered attention, knows something different. Access is not kindness. Access is responsibility, and giving it to the wrong people doesn't just cost time. It costs clarity. Focus. Momentum. Sometimes even trust, because when too many voices enter a room, the original signal gets lost, and once that signal fades, rebuilding it becomes incredibly difficult. The colleague walked toward the door before leaving, but just before stepping out, they said something else. Something that stayed long after the room emptied. "Just remember, the people who get upset about boundaries were usually benefiting from the lack of them." Then they left, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the conversation itself, because deep down, there was a realization forming: filtering people wasn't the hard part. The hard part was accepting what the filter would reveal. Some people would disappear quietly, some would adapt, and some would reveal that they were never really aligned in the first place. But the most difficult discovery was still ahead, because the people who resist boundaries the most are often the ones who once felt closest. And if you've ever faced that moment, the moment when protecting your focus begins to reshape your relationships, then you already know the question that slowly starts rising beneath the surface. Not whether boundaries are necessary, but whether you're ready to see who remains when they exist. By the time you begin filtering access, the world around you doesn't just change. It rearranges itself, quietly at first. Then unmistakably, some people grow closer. Oddly enough, they respect the distance. They adapt to the new rhythm. Others drift away, not dramatically, just slowly. Fewer messages, shorter conversations, less curiosity. And if you're paying attention, you start noticing something uncomfortable. Many relationships were built on availability, not alignment. It's a hard realization. Because when you remove unlimited access, you're not just protecting your time, you're exposing the true structure of your connections, and sometimes that structure is weaker than you expected. There was a night, not long after the shift had begun late. Again, most of the building was dark except for a few scattered offices still glowing with stubborn light, the kind of hour when the air inside large workspaces feels strangely hollow, the hum of distant machines, the faint echo of footsteps down empty hallways. In one of the offices, a screen cast pale blue light across a desk crowded with diagrams, notes, and half-finished calculations. The work itself wasn't the problem. The work was always energizing, but something else had begun to feel different. The silence, not the peaceful kind, the reflective kind. When you start limiting access to people, the noise disappears. And with it, something else disappears too, the illusion that you were surrounded by more support than you actually were. It's a strange psychological shift. When you're constantly available, you're constantly interacting, constantly responding, constantly engaging. It creates the feeling of a large network around you. But once access narrows, the circle becomes smaller. Sometimes much smaller. And for a moment, usually late at night, when there are no distractions left, a question surfaces: did I just isolate myself? It's a fear many people never talk about, because boundaries look strong from the outside, but from the inside, they can feel lonely. The phone that once buzzed constantly now stays quiet for long stretches. The inbox that used to flood with messages now fills more slowly. And in that quiet space, your mind begins examining everything. Were those relationships real, or were they simply fueled by proximity? If you've ever been the person others depend on, the one people come to for direction, ideas, or momentum, then you know how seductive that constant interaction can be. It makes you feel needed, relevant, connected, but there's a darker side to being needed. People often value the role you play in their lives more than the person you actually are, and once that role becomes harder to access, the connection changes. Sometimes it disappears completely. There was another moment, not in an office this time. Outside. Cold air, early morning before sunrise. The kind of quiet hour when the sky is still dark, but the horizon is beginning to soften into grey. A nearly empty parking lot stretched out under dim street lights. A few distant engines humming to life as early workers prepared for another long day. Standing there in the cool silence, something became clear. When access disappears, so do certain kinds of attention. The people who thrived on constant communication slowly vanish, but the ones who remain, they show up differently. They don't demand updates, they don't chase proximity, they simply respect the distance, and that difference reveals something important. Real alignment doesn't require constant access. In fact, it often thrives without it. But recognizing that truth doesn't erase the emotional friction that comes with the transition, because somewhere along the way, someone always confronts you, not aggressively, but directly. It happened during a conversation with someone who had once been deeply involved, someone who had enjoyed regular updates, frequent conversations. An open line of communication. Now, those conversations had become rare. Intentional. Focused. And eventually, the question arrived: why do I feel like you're shutting people out? The tone carried more confusion than accusation, but the implication was their access had changed, and that change felt personal. For a moment, the easiest response would have been reassurance, a quick explanation, a promise that nothing had really changed, but that wouldn't have been honest, because something had changed. Perspective. Clarity. Understanding. Instead of answering immediately, there was a pause, a long one, the kind of pause that makes people slightly uncomfortable. Finally, the answer came, quiet but steady: I'm not shutting people out. Another pause: I'm protecting what I need to think clearly. The words didn't feel dramatic. But they carried weight. Because the truth about protecting access is simple, but rarely popular. When you stop giving unlimited attention, people who benefited from it feel the loss, even if that attention was never meant to be permanent. And that realization creates one of the most difficult emotional tensions successful people face. The tension between generosity and self-preservation. Give too much, and your focus dissolves. Protect too much, and people accuse you of changing, becoming distant, becoming cold. But here's the quiet truth very few people say out loud. Growth almost always changes your accessibility, not because success makes you arrogant, but because responsibility demands concentration. And concentration requires silence, not total silence, but enough of it to think deeply. To solve problems others don't even see yet. To hold an entire vision in your mind without it being diluted by constant outside noise. The person across the table listened quietly after that explanation. They didn't argue, but their expression revealed something complicated. Understanding mixed with disappointment, because when people lose access, they don't just lose information, they lose proximity to the momentum of your life. And that momentum can be intoxicating. Especially for those who once stood close to it. But after that conversation ended, another realization settled in. One that many people resist until they're forced to face it. Not everyone who wants access actually respects the weight of your responsibility. Some people just miss the feeling of being close to it, and once you see that difference clearly, something inside you changes permanently. You stop apologizing for the distance. You stop over-explaining your boundaries. You begin to understand that protecting your focus isn't rejection. It's leadership. But even that understanding doesn't remove the final challenge. Because sooner or later, every person who protects their access faces the same final question. If not everyone deserves access, then who does? And what happens when the answer forces you to choose fewer people than you expected? By the time you truly understand access, the world around you looks different. Not dramatically. But clearly. The noise fades first. The constant requests, the endless small conversations, the quiet pressure to always be available. And in that silence, something unexpected appears. Clarity. Because when fewer voices surround you, the ones that remain become impossible to ignore. And this is where the final realization begins. Not everyone who wants access deserves it. But more importantly, the people who truly deserve it rarely ask for it. They don't push their way into your attention. They don't demand updates. They don't treat your time like an unlimited resource. They move differently. They respect the distance. They trust that when something matters, they'll be part of it. And that quiet respect reveals something powerful. Access is not about who is closest. It's about who understands the weight of being close. There was a moment when this finally became undeniable. Not during a meeting, not during a negotiation, but during something far simpler. A long evening conversation with someone who had been around for years. Not the loudest voice in the room, not the most demanding presence. In fact, they rarely asked for anything. The two of them sat outside after a long day. The sky was dark now, the city lights stretching across the horizon like scattered constellations. The kind of quiet night where conversations become slower, more honest. For a while, neither person said much, just the soft sound of distant traffic and the occasional gust of cool wind moving through the empty space. Then the other person spoke. Not a question, just an observation. You've been protecting your time a lot more lately. There was no accusation in their voice, just awareness. And that difference mattered, because awareness feels very different from expectation. After a moment, the answer came simply, yes. Another quiet pause. The other person nodded slightly. I figured. And then they said something that revealed everything. You probably should have done that earlier. That sentence carried no resentment. No disappointment, just understanding. And in that moment, the truth became obvious. The people who truly respect you don't fear your boundaries. They recognize the necessity of them. They understand something others miss. Access is not a reward. It's a responsibility. Because when someone has access to your time, your attention, your thinking, they are standing very close to the engine of your life. And engines are powerful things, but they're also fragile. To many hands near the controls, and direction disappears. To many opinions inside the system, and momentum collapses. Protecting access isn't arrogance. It's maintenance. It's protecting the clarity required to build something meaningful. And the people who deserve to remain close, they understand that instinctively. They don't demand constant explanations. They don't interpret distance as rejection. They trust the mission more than their own proximity to it. That kind of person is rare. Far rarer than most people realize, because many relationships in life are built around shared convenience, shared timing, shared environments. But very few are built around shared understanding. And once you begin protecting access, only the ones built on understanding survive. Everyone else slowly fades into the background of your life, not because you pushed them away, but because they were only connected through the open door. Once that door becomes intentional, the relationship reveals its true shape. Some people walk away, some try to force it open again, but the rare few, they simply knock when it matters and respect the silence when it doesn't. If you've ever felt like the person responsible for holding a vision others don't fully see yet, then you know how heavy that responsibility can become. You feel it when you wake up. You feel it when you sit quietly at night trying to solve problems no one else is thinking about. You feel it in the quiet moments when the world expects answers you haven't discovered yet. And in those moments, your attention becomes the most valuable resource you have. Not money, not influence. Attention. Where you place it determines everything. The direction of your ideas, the people who shape your thinking, the future you're slowly building. That's why access matters more than most people realize, because the people closest to your attention inevitably influence your direction, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, and if the wrong voices stay too close for too long, even the strongest vision can begin to bend. That's the hidden cost of unlimited openness. But the moment you understand that, the moment you truly accept that access must be earned, something inside you becomes calmer, not colder. Just clearer. You stop trying to maintain relationships that only exist because you were always available. You stop explaining every boundary. You stop apologizing for protecting your focus, and instead, you begin honoring something deeper. Your responsibility to the work that only you can do. Your responsibility to the vision that exists in your mind before anyone else can see it. And the people who belong in that space, they won't resent the boundary, they'll respect it, because they understand that proximity to purpose is a privilege, not a right. And maybe that's the quiet lesson many people eventually learn. Not everyone deserves access to your attention. Not everyone deserves a seat near the direction of your life. And that's not cruelty. It's clarity. Some of you listening already know this feeling. You've been the one people rely on. The one who listens, the one who carries more than others realize. And somewhere along the way, you started noticing the difference between people who respect your energy and people who simply consume it. Once you see that difference, everything changes. You become more intentional with your time, more careful with your attention, more selective with your inner circle. Not because you've become distant, but because you finally understand the cost of being endlessly open. And the strange thing is, the right people will never punish you for protecting your focus. They'll respect you more for it. So here's something worth thinking about tonight. When you look at the people who currently have access to your attention, your time, your energy, how many of them truly respect the responsibility that access carries? And how many simply got used to the door being open? Some of you already know the answer. And if this perspective resonated with you, if you've ever felt the quiet tension between generosity and protecting your own clarity, then you're exactly the kind of thinker this space was created for. So I'm curious, have you ever had a moment when you realized not everyone deserved the same access to your life? Let me know in the comments. Because sometimes the most powerful conversations start when people finally admit what they've quietly learned the hard way. And if these reflections speak to the way you see the world, stay close. There are many more truths like this waiting to be explored.